The Nicaraguan Revolution from 1976 to 79 was a conflict that involved a limited guerrilla campaign linked to a major political challenge to a single-party state system in Nicaragua. Since the revolution was primarily the result of growing political challenge, its starting point is difficult to pinpoint. Indeed, many historians believe that the real Nicaraguan revolution was actually achieved after rebels took power in 1979, as major reforms transformed the country and led to a larger conflict that lasted for a decade. You need to consider the following key questions. What were the main causes of the Nicaraguan Revolution? Why did Somoza fall from power in mid-1979? And to what extent did the revolution affect Nicaraguan politics, economics, and society? In the 1970s, the Nicaraguan Revolution erupted when the ruling family, the Somozas, faced a guerrilla campaign and political revolt from groups who were unhappy about how the country was being run. Most Nicaraguans lived in dire poverty, and the political system had been dominated by one family for decades. Its economic and political development had remained limited, despite the involvement of other countries due to Nicaragua's strategically important location in the region. The four major causes of the Nicaraguan Revolution are the Somoza dictatorship, the fact that he then created a dynasty that became very corrupt, economic problems were prevalent during this time period, and then with the rise of opposition and revolt pre-1972, led to a strong group that wanted to overthrow that ruling family. Nicaragua became independent in 1938 and, except for a few brief periods, was politically stable until the 1890s, when a series of revolts and civil wars plagued the country. The USA, interested in possibly constructing a canal across the country to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, before finally deciding to construct one through Panama instead, deployed troops to stabilize the country's political systems in 1909. Continued revolts led to the creation of the National Guard by the United States in 1927. The organization, which functioned as both police and army for Nicaragua, was led by Anastasio Somoza Garcia, known as Somoza Sr., who overthrew the government in 1936. He was then elected president in December 1936 with only 100 votes cast against him, with his term beginning in January 1937. Somoza Sr. placed family members in leading government positions and used the National Guard to manage elections, which kept him in power. While consolidating his authority, he cultivated close ties with the United States. Nicaragua, for example, was one of the first countries to declare war on the Axis powers in the Second World War, after the U.S. was attacked by Japan on December 7, 1941. The Nicaraguan government seized German and Italian property during this war and accommodated war refugees. Nicaragua joined the United Nations at the end of the Second World War and always supported the U.S. political position. During the Cold War, Nicaragua cooperated fully with U.S. efforts against the spread of communist-friendly regimes. Somoza Sr. helped in the 1954 invasion of Guatemala, and Nicaragua was a staging area for the Bay of Pigs attack on Cuba by Cuban exiles in 1961. Somoza Sr. served as president from January 1, 1937 until May 1, 1947. After a brief interlude, he returned to the presidency in 1950. He had two sons that he carefully groomed to help him control Nicaragua and rule it after his death. His eldest son was Luis Somoza, and he was expected to follow his father as president. The second son was Anastasio Somoza Dybala, commonly referred to only as Somoza. He was groomed to command the National Guard, the power behind the Samosa Dynasty. Somoza Sr. had the Constitution changed in 1955 to allow him to run for president again. This prompted the nationalist poet Rigoberto Lopez Perez, an outraged poet, to assassinate him in 1956. He was immediately replaced by his son, Luis. Luis Somoza served as president of Nicaragua from 1956 until 1963 and instituted some reforms, such as allowing limited political opposition. While confirming his brother as head of the National Guard, he transitioned the family from direct rule to indirect rule by having René Schnick elected president. Schnick was controlled by the Somozas until his death in 1966. In April 1967, Luis died, and by the end of the year, Somoza, his younger brother, became the president in an election managed by the National Guard, which he commanded. He made his half-brother, Jose Somoza, the new head of the National Guard. The Samosa Dynasty had little effective opposition through the majority of its rule. Those who rebelled against the government were usually jailed for a year or so, often under house arrest, and then pardoned. A few were even exiled. While there were human rights violations on occasion, the National Guard and the government rarely bothered the majority of the rural population. Although the rural population was poor, they were also religious and dependent on work found on large agricultural estates owned by the Somoza family or other wealthy landowners. They were not part of the political system, had little time to oppose the government, and were mostly illiterate with no ability to organize any form of opposition. They were also easy to intimidate by the National Guard if the need arose, which it rarely did. Nicaragua had very uneven economic development, with the vast majority of the population living in poverty, while the ruling family used its position to increasingly control the economy. The Somoza family not only controlled the political and military institutions in Nicaragua, they also controlled the economy. Somoza Sr., with control of the presidency and the National Guard, used the government's institutions to buy the best farmlands in the country. He also seized land which had never been officially registered to owners, and land granted to former rebels in the early 1930s as part of peace agreements. Italian and German property seized in the Second World War was sold cheaply to Somoza. Using government money, he built infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and electricity stations for his vast holdings, which were intensely cultivated by poor peasants working for minimum wages. National Guardsmen often cleared forests from his lands and planted his fields. By the late 1930s, the Somozas owned coffee, cotton, and beef cattle plantations. They were able to dominate the beef export market by having the government charge export taxes only on other exporters. Somoza's senior economic empire consisted of sugar mills, alcohol distilleries, 51 cattle ranches, 46 coffee plantations, a shipping company, a national airline, and a port city. He also became the director of the Pacific Railroad Company, which transported all goods to market. He received personal financial gifts from U.S. companies so as to be able to develop within his country. He also prohibited companies other than his own from importing products into Nicaragua, and he purchased vast properties in the USA and Canada. The National Guard was yet another Somoza family holding that they completely controlled, and they managed the country's health services. They controlled all radio broadcasts. They operated prisons, national railways, and the postal system. They produced and sold liquor and weapons, and they controlled the borders, thereby managing imports and exports. Under the presidency of Somoza, son of Somoza Sr., the family controlled over the economy as it expanded. During his rule, half of all registered land in Nicaragua was owned by the family. By the mid-1970s, it was estimated that the Somosas owned 346 companies, and Somoza was known as one of the world's wealthiest people. While the Somosas controlled the economy and the government, the majority of Nicaraguans lived in extreme poverty. The World Health Organization reported that Nicaragua had the second highest incidences of disease like typhoid in the Americas, and that malnutrition caused the death of half of all children who died under the age of 5. The Inter-American Development Bank reported in 1972 that from 1960 to 1972, the gross national product had risen by 7.1%, meaning that the poor did not benefit from the massive economic growth. The growing gap between the wealthy, led by the Somosas, and the poor, primarily rural population, would be a key factor in gathering national support for opposition to Somoza after 1974. The United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America actually released a report in 1972 that said 67% of the rural population could not read or write, 59% of the homes had no electricity, 26% of the urban homes were connected to sewage treatment systems, 54% of homes had no access to safe drinking water, and 69% of rural homes had dirt floors. The majority of the population may have supported the Somoza family for a variety of reasons. There were some who openly challenged them. Since it was impossible to work through the governmental system to create change, they worked outside the system with varying success. Opponents were usually treated lightly as they were from a small group of wealthy and better educated elite, and therefore often related to the Somozas or their political allies. Harsh punishments would have potentially caused further dissent. In Managua, the capital, the government allowed La Prensa, the newspaper with the largest circulation in the country, to be published, although it was owned and operated by the biggest political opponent of the regime, Pedro Chamorro. Chamorro attempted a minor rebellion against the state in 1954, which led to a year in prison and a year of house arrest. After Somoza Sr. was assassinated, Chamorro was sent to prison again for 6 months, along with many others who opposed the government, although they had nothing to do with the murder. He fled to Costa Rica in 1956 and visited Cuba after the rise of Fidel Castro in 1959. Chamorro returned to Nicaragua in 1959 and attempted another rebellion with 100 others he had recruited. After 15 days of fighting and running, the rebels surrendered. Although a few died in battles, most were sentenced to prison and freed a year later. Chamorro returned to La Prensa in 1969 and continued his attacks on the regime through his newspaper. The FSLN, or the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or I will just call them the Sandinistas, began in 1961, adding Sandinista to the name in 1963 in remembrance of Sandino, a popular leader of rebellions in 1920s and 1930s. The founders of the Sandinistas were inspired by the writings of Marx and Lenin, as well as Castro's success against the regime of Cuba. In the first years, although inspired by socialism and communism, they did not clearly communicate their philosophy, perhaps to retain cohesion in the group, where not everyone could agree on which governmental system to follow. They could agree, however, that the Somoza regime needed to be removed, and that the way to do it was to mobilize rural, impoverished peasants. 60 members crossed from Honduras into Nicaragua in 1962 with the intention of taking control of a small area before expanding their territory. The National Guard quickly killed about 20 Sandinistas in fighting and captured almost all the rest. A few made it back to Honduras. The group was presumed extinct by the government since there was no more activity for the next few years. In December 1966, 35 Sandinistas crossed into Nicaragua and ordered to fight the National Guard in small, quick battles. By August 1967, 20 rebels were dead and most of the rest had fled to Cuba. It seems that a major problem for the Sandinistas was the peasants themselves. They feared National Guard retaliation and did not understand Sandinista goals. To them, Sandinistas were outsiders and they preferred to trust the National Guard, who they knew and who rarely bothered them. In 1969, the Sandinistas finally published their overall goals. Some of these were to improve the status of women and minorities, to seize major estates from the wealthy and redistribute them to the peasants, to seize major wealth, redistributing it to the population as a whole, to improve healthcare and education, to improve human rights and freedom of the individual, and to establish a revolutionary government to accomplish all the above. And for this, the United States thought of them as enemies. Sandinistas received military training primarily in Cuba and in 1972 tried to restart the rebellion in Nicaragua's north. Again, peasants distrusted them and assisted the National Guard in locating them. Many Sandinista leaders were killed, but their fight caught the attention of Catholic youth in the district of Managua, Nicaragua's capital. The youth group created a commune of sorts, living around the church of a sympathetic priest, where they studied Christian teachings in the morning, went to the university of the day, and discussed Marxism in the evenings. A Sandinista visited in late 1972 to meet the group, and in 1973 the students left the commune to join the underground movement. It was not the peasantry whose opposition to Samosa could be found, but rather an urban, generally affluent youth who were disturbed by the corruption and lack of democracy. Then the earthquake of 1972 helped push them to join the rebels.